One of the things that becomes kind of abundantly evident when you read the writings of the Apostle Paul was that he had a deep concern about people drifting away from the Word of God. It's interesting that every book of the New Testament, except for the little book of Philemon, has at some point addresses the issue of false teachings, the twisting, the distorting, the misrepresenting, the out of context teaching of the Word of God. And there's an obligation that we have, we're told in 2 Timothy 2:15, that we need to labor arduously as servants of God to rightly divide the word of truth. In other words, literally to handle the Bible in the appropriate way. You remember early in the week I said that if the clear sense makes good sense, don't seek any other sense lest you end up with a bunch of nonsense. And oftentimes you can tell that something isn't sound because its logical end is not reasonable and certainly not something that you would like to be part of. So Paul's pressure here is saying, I'm really yearning for you to hold out the Word of God in a way that's clear and concise, that we don't overstate it, we don't understate it, we don't even teach our own personal convictions or conjectures as if they're facts when we can't prove them. I think a classic example has to deal with a lot of end times theology. One of the big arguments is, when does the rapture take place? Is it the beginning of the tribulation, or before, or is it in the middle, or is it partway through the end, or is it the very end? They have different names, pre-trib, mid-trib, pre-wrath, post-trib. And each have their passages and way of looking at passages that kind of support their argument. But the reality is, it's never stated in such clear and concise terms like the virgin birth or the second coming that we can absolutely say this is essential. And so we never make, at least I never make your view on the rapture a condition of fellowship, because I don't think we have the biblical strength of conviction to be able to say that. But at the same time, we're having the argument for the same reason. We're both convicted and committed to interpreting the Word of God and doing it as accurately as possible. And that means that we may have some debate. You present your argument, I'll present mine. And as you're presenting yours, I have the obligation to listen to your argument. And you have the obligation to listen to mine with respect and understanding. The only time I draw the line is when somebody tells me that God told them they can do something that I know the Bible clearly says they can't. It's like I've had people come to me and say, well, God told me I married the wrong person, so I'm divorcing my husband or wife. I'm going to marry this new person. And I kind of got to bring back saying, well, you know what? Jesus said what God has joined together, let nobody take apart. Well, God didn't join us together. I said, do you sleep together? It says you're one flesh. So if you ever slept together, you're one flesh, you're together. I mean, you have to really apply the Word of God to that situation. And unless you have a very narrow, exceptional reason for doing something like that, then you're in sin and you're perverting the Word of God. So, case in point, I guess what I'm trying to establish is that we need to understand that keeping true to the Word of God is the primary obligation. And the question we often ask is, God, I want to know what your will is. And God has expressed his will to us in his Word. And so our goal and our striving is to be obedient to it. But then as Paul comes really to the end of this whole section, I need to kind of move on the passage. He makes this final statement where he says that his goal, of course, was to see them as effective and fruitful and passionate for God as he was. But then he adds, but even if I'm being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. This is interesting. This phrase "drink offering" is not something that's part of our culture, but the Greek word "spendo" means a libation, and libations were a central part of most ancient sacrificial, if not all ancient sacrificial systems. I mean, the earliest records we have go to ancient Sumeria some 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, where basically they refer to the libation literally as drink, because essentially when somebody died, they felt that the person in the grave was just eating dirt and dust, and so they put a tube down into the grave and they'd pour water down it or drink down it so that they would have something to refresh themselves. I know it sounds crazy, but somehow that passed into generations where the idea, when you made an offering to God, it not only was an animal like a blood sacrifice, but it also would include, in the New Old Testament, they poured wine over the altar as a drink offering or a libation. In fact, we even find in Isaiah 53, when he talks about the Messiah, he says, the libation is used kind of as a metaphor for Christ as he suffers. He says in the phrase, verse 12 of Isaiah 53, he was poured out his life unto death. And the idea of life being in the blood, he poured out his blood as an offering. So this idea where Paul says, I am being poured out like a drink offering in sacrifice and service for your faith, he says, I count that as an honor. In fact, I like the way the Amplified rendered it. They said, even if my lifeblood must be poured out as a libation on the sacrificial offering of your faith, he adds, so you too should be glad and rejoice with me. In other words, he's saying to us that I count it such an honor to lay my life in service for you. If that leads to you becoming more of Christ and more fulfilled in your service to God, then I'm glad. And I'm telling you, you should be rejoicing and celebrating with me. And Paul, what he's referring to is the fact that he might very well face execution, and he might literally shed his blood as a sacrifice and service for them. And so he's telling them, if I die in the service of the cross, I'm going to be glad, and I want you to rejoice with me in that sacrifice, that I'm laying down my life for Christ and the gospel. It's kind of strange for us because we know that Jesus said there's no greater love that a man can have than to lay down his life for his friend. And we often, put that on carving in stone in cemeteries, especially where men and women who have given their life, their ultimate sacrifice in service of their land, country, their friends, their family. And we recognize the inherent nobility in that sacrifice of self. Isn't that interesting? We recognize the inherent nobility of sacrifice. Well, that recognition is something that God put in us, that we might recognize it in the gift of his Son upon the cross. And so what Paul is essentially setting the example for is being willing to give up everything for him. And, one of my biggest frustrations is I find that you and I tend to be negotiators with God. We want to see how much of a blessing can we get with the lowest payment for that blessing. In other words, Lord, what do I need to do to just get enough of your goodness that I can be healthy, wealthy, and wise the rest of my life? And it even flows into kind of a bargaining. If we go and get the diagnosis from the doctor and it's kind of scary or frightening, then we start saying, God, if you heal me, if you save me, then I'll do X, Y, and Z. And what's really amazing to me is I find that many times God hears those prayers. He honors those prayers. But the simple fact is that God already owns you. It's not like you're giving him something that he doesn't have. You're just withholding from him that which is his own. And so I belong to him. He owns me. He has total will over my life. And basically, if I want to know joy and rejoicing, then I will surrender to that reality. And basically, that everybody around me should celebrate that as well. You see, when I told my parents that I was going to go into the ministry, my dad's literal statement that came out of his mouth was, where did we go wrong? Because to him, that was the biggest failure of his life, was for me to choose to be a servant of God. And I get it from his point of view because he had these issues with the church. But be that as it may, it wasn't something that he rejoiced in, it's something he grieved with. And I think about Christian parents many times when their sons or daughters saying, I feel called to go into the mission field, I feel called to serve in this ministry, and they begrudge it. They want to see their kids become healthy, wealthy, and wise. They want to see them successful. They want to be able to tell their friends, yes, Johnny's now the corporate executive and he's a CEO of, and isn't he a great, and has he accomplished all these wonderful things? And believe me, I'm not exempt from that. I find myself bragging on my kids too, and shamefully so sometimes. But the simple fact is that when we choose to give our life to Christ and to follow him, there is no higher calling. There is no greater honor that we can have to say, I want to, Lord, live according to your will for my life. and live that to the utmost of my ability. That's really what Paul said. You should be rejoicing and celebrating that fact that if it leads to my death, that I've done it for the glory of God, and I encourage you to follow my example. And that's really what it comes down to, following that example. Well, I hope this has been a good week for you, and I find myself tremendously honored being able to do this, and I hope this encourages you and brings joy and blessing into your life. So, catch you next week. Go in His grace.